That's really the mission of Ometry. Ometry is a risk technology company. We measure road safety using sort of a different approach. I think it's very relevant as we're in the COVID crisis, all news related to COVID, but auto insurance and measuring road risk is particularly timely as well. So during COVID, we're seeing drastic declines in vehicle miles traveled. Everyone's staying home. Some measures range between 50 and 75% of people or of vehicle miles have gone down since folks have been starting to stay home in March. At the same time, fatal crashes, the proportion that are fatal, are actually increasing. So, sort of an unexpected behavioral consequence of COVID-19 that we need to be tracking. Obviously, it has a life and death consequence, but also as it relates to the insurance industry, we see billions of dollars being returned in premium to personal lines auto insurance customers that may or may not be taking into consideration not just reductions in crashes, but the severity of the crashes that are happening during COVID. We see this in places across the US. In Austin, Texas, for example, traffic volume went down by about 50%. Traffic crashes only went down about 20%. And fatal crashes over this period increased by 15%. In New York City, we're starting to understand a little bit more about why. Speed camera issued tickets went up about 57%, meaning this isn't an over-policing problem. These are the cameras on the light posts that are tracking when people are driving by. It's picking up that people are speeding more. With space, people are opening up in places that they would normally be stuck in a gridlock. And in New York City, we're seeing the consequence of that there are far more fatal crashes over the same period from March to April than any of the previous 5 years. When it comes to insurance and how this relates to our industry, insurance carriers, as I mentioned, have returned about $10 billion of premium surplus to consumers thus far, but they may not have factored in this question of severity. When we think about how the market is moving, how consumers are demanding more usage-based insurance programs, they want to pay for what they use. I worry that actually usage-based insurance carriers are not better prepared than the traditional insurers. Remember, vehicle miles traveled is going down. So by that measure, we're not capturing what's really going on with these severe and fatal crashes. We think this is a very big market opportunity, a moment for many insurance carriers and frankly, others who are stepping into the space like auto manufacturers to begin providing usage-based insurance and measuring the risk of driving more accurately. We think supply and demand for what we call location-enabled insurance is really on the rise. But today, it still only represents about 5% of the overall market. So we can think about that as, oh geez, this is small, this is nuanced, this is just a small segment of the market. But I think the alternative way to look at this is there's 95% of consumers out there today who might benefit from this program, and they're there for the taking. So for those insurance carriers, I think this is a really important moment to see opportunity in crisis. Of course, auto manufacturers are also stepping into the space. Just put one example here of Toyota partnering with Nationwide. There are many others that have essentially installed the devices that track the locations of drivers as well as maybe speeding and hard braking and other behaviors. Really important to essentially lower the friction to customer adoption, make sure that these devices are used by more folks, and again, seize the opportunity in crisis. So how does Ometry sort of help accelerate this transition? How do we play in the conversation? Well, we're providing the road safety measurements that insurance carriers, particularly usage-based insurers or carriers that have telematics devices on the personal line side or electronic logging devices, ELDs, on the commercial line side, know where it's unsafe to drive with location-specific risk scores. So what we do is gather a whole bunch of data about the road safety. How safe are the roads? It's environmental characteristics like weather, traffic volume, roadway characteristics, and maybe, and importantly to this conversation, the historical record of crashes. Where crashes happened before are going to be an important predictor of where they might happen in the future. So Ometry collects millions of pieces of data about crashes. We'll start there. We collect and monitor, currently we have a dashboard up called crashometry.com. Has about 1.6 million crashes that we're monitoring across 5 states, and we're adding more every day. The data is current and fresh. We're sourcing it from local police departments and departments of transportation. We think it's going to be important to monitor things like the number of crashes and the proportion that are fatal to really bring the numbers to bear about what will be the new normal during COVID, however long that lasts, and when we start to open back up and drivers get back on the road. We know that the historical crashes are a leading indicator of risk that we're otherwise not capturing in usage-based insurance or traditional insurance metrics. So we think that these are important statistics to be able to do things like refile rates. These are New York City stats. I'll tell you, when I saw these numbers, my immediate reaction, you can ask anyone on our team, was check these numbers. They are so astronomically high. They are worrisome. They are terrifying. They're scary, right? Being on the road, even though there are fewer cars and fewer crashes, the crashes that are happening are deadlier. If you look at the visualization below, you see the trend sort of over time, what we're really tracking here. This is what we want to monitor. This is what we want to keep tabs on for public health and safety to make sure that people who are on the road right now get from point A to point B safely, get home safely, to protect essential workers who need to be on the road, and frankly, our truck drivers and our delivery drivers who are keeping what is left of our economy moving. I wanted to point everyone to this very free, very public resource to be shared among friends, among family, among colleagues, and especially essential workers, and hopefully our government to be acknowledging that the risk is changing. And risk techs like Ometry are monitoring it. Insurance carriers obviously have a very strong financial interest in monitoring these trends as they change over time as well. So how do we get ahead of the problem? How do we anticipate and predict where crashes are likely to happen so that we can advise our customers on where to drive safely or where not to drive if it is unsafe? And we can, again, make sure our commercial fleets are delivering those packages and goods, and frankly, they themselves, the drivers, are staying safe on the road as well. To anticipate where crashes are likely, we start gathering other data in addition to the historical record of crashes. We add things like weather conditions or whether visibility and precipitation are affecting your ability to see other cars on the road. We look at traffic volume. If you're driving in the middle of the desert and there are no other cars around you, it is a much more safe environment than if you're driving in traffic all of the time. And then we look at roadway infrastructure as well. The data on roadway infrastructure is quite expansive, about 250 variables wide. We look at things like how many lanes are there, how many cars parked on the right-hand side, whether there are barriers, medians, gutters, what is the speed limit. We're looking at all of the factors that we know are likely to contribute to crashes. The physical nature of the road really matters. So each month we ingest this data and we build a predictive model that measures the probability of a crash in the next 30 days for every single road across the state. So adding geographic specificity helps us get closer to measuring the actual exposure of this driver. This information is really important when we think about the use cases for data like these. When we are able to risk rate every road, in this image, I'm showing Washington, D.C. What we do when we score all of the roads, though, is then work with those carriers that have ELD devices or telematics or tracking where their drivers are going. We're saying, look, is a driver more exposed? Are they on these dangerous roads? And if they are, can they do something about it? Can they begin to think about alternatives? So we'll take location information from the carrier, from a telematics provider, from anybody who has a location information. This location information is really valuable to us because if you know where your drivers are, you can begin to evaluate, are they disproportionately exposed to risk? It doesn't need to be a telematics, it doesn't need to be an ALD, it can be as simple as a phone app that just asks where you're driving. We don't require our customers to provide any PII in this exchange. I actually don't want to know who's driving. I don't want to know their name, their demographics, their claims history, their premium. All I need is the location, the time that they were there, and maybe a de-identified identifier so that I can re-aggregate the results to a route or to a customer. I can show you one route looks like this or one customer looks like this. That helps us work with customers really easily as well, because we don't have to go through some of the more traditional or difficult legal and IT procurement processes when we're sharing data that doesn't require us to know who your customers might be. Where I think the opportunity is for not just a risk technology like Ometry, but risk technologies in general. We call ours Atlas, harkening back to the Atlas that you used to put in the back seat of your car. What we're doing is working with folks on loss prevention, underwriting, and pricing. So on loss prevention, we're actually building integrations into customer-facing applications so that a driver who gets their route to and from to deliver a package can route not only for gas mileage or for speed, but also for safety. We see simple things like changing the on-ramp that you enter the highway. Very little cost difference, very little gas mileage difference to go one exit up can significantly reduce the exposure to crash risk. We're adding this data into routing optimization algorithms. This is typically for like a commercial fleet that is using more sophisticated routing technology, whereas most fleets may simply just be printing our maps and adding some highlights and pointing out roads that they may want their drivers to avoid. And lastly, and importantly to this conversation, it can be integrated into underwriter platforms. So what we're able to achieve here is some segmentation. Which drivers are on the most unsafe roads? How often are they on those roads? Are there specific drivers that are more exposed than others? Are they behaving poorly on those roads? If we gather some data about their speed, we can begin to know the guy who was going 103, actually, he happened to be in the desert. So he's not maybe as bad of a risk as I thought he was. Whereas the person going 35 in a 20 on the most dangerous road in all of Texas, I do want to start thinking about how do I share that information back to the customer to help them change their behaviors, avoid those unsafe areas, and again, sort of create a circuitous loop here to both manage the risk better by measuring more of the risk. It's an important thing to consider that what Ometry is doing is very intuitive. We are measuring more of the risk of the road. When we measure more of the risk, we can manage it better. There's less uncertainty about what's going on. And today's volatile environment on the road, where crashes are going down, vehicle miles are going down, but the proportion of fatal crashes is going up, is different than what we would have expected. The data doesn't lie. We need to be monitoring more of the risk going forward so that we can be responsible stewards to our customers and to our shareholders who expect us to figure out how to return to profitability during and after COVID. So I want to thank you in advance for listening to my take on this or why it's so important to be measuring more of the risk. Thank you.